If you've been using the 90-90 setup to increase your internal rotation of your hip and you haven't seen the results you're looking for, you should probably watch the rest of this video. So when people are doing the 90-90 for internal rotation, we'd be looking at how can we find internal rotation first. The biggest problem when people are doing the 90-90, when they're trying to address how well does their hip internally rotate, it's ensuring that we're finding the right stretch and we're able to find the right contractions when we do our isometrics. So not all 90-90 setups are created equal. And people do the 90-90 and expect it to give them what they want, when in reality we need to be able to take what we want from the setup, assuming we know what to look for and what positioning we need. So when we're doing the 90-90 setup, it is really crucial to ensure that we get no pinching through any portions of this drill. Pinching would likely occur as you rotate your pelvis relative to your femur. So the femur is still and you're rotating the pelvis around it. And if you get pinching in your hip, I would encourage you to slide your hands back so we're not sitting so upright into hip flexion. It's a little bit hard to manage that deep of a range of motion. So for most people, if they're in this position, sliding back a bit so that they can be in relative hip flexion and not end range hip flexion is probably a good idea for them. So while we're looking for our internal rotation stretch, we want to make sure that we're extending at the lumbar spine, and we want to try to anteriorly tilt our pelvis. So you can see how I am trying to stick my butt up in a sense, and that should help you initiate the stretch for internal rotation. So as I'm sitting in this 90-90 position, you can have this opposing leg closed because we don't care about trying to train external rotation of that hip. You're going to extend your spine a little bit, and then you're going to rotate your pelvis while maintaining that extended lumbar spine and the anterior pelvic tilt that I just mentioned until we find a stretch. A couple rotations back and forth may help you find the stretch we're looking for. And again, if you need to slide backwards a little bit, that's an option as well. Depending on somebody's current mobility status and their situation, they may find that having their hands on blocks to kind of help them extend their spine and anteriorly tilt their pelvis, this extended position with the blocks may encourage you to get out of pinching, and it may help you find a deeper stretch with less compensations from the surrounding joints, being the pelvis and the lumbar spine. If you feel your knee in your internal rotation stretch, I encourage you to play around with what zone of range of motion your femur is in, your upper thigh, and you may need to straighten or bend your knee a little bit in order to find the right tissue. If you have no success with that, same concept, we want to lean back. We might be able to find a little bit more of a stretch so we're not so deep into range of motion that we technically can't manage. And if none of that works for you, then we need to be doing rails, EQIs, eccentric quasi-isometrics, to help turn on our internal rotators, and I'll put a link to that in the bio of this video. So you may need to be doing a more extensive warm-up to help find internal rotation. So once we find our internal rotation stretch, we want to go ahead and hang out there for at least 2 minutes. We need to be spending enough time here to ensure that we are giving our hip a reason to open up and stretch. And so as we breathe into that stretch, it should feel like a very deep, nauseating bone stretching. That's because internal rotation is the deepest portion of our hip. Because it's the deepest portion of our hip, it's not going to feel like muscle stretching. It's going to feel like bone stretching. And once you find that sensation, you can't miss it, then go ahead and just try to replicate it and get deeper into the stretch by any means necessary. So if that means rotating the pelvis a little bit further, if that means sitting my butt down into the ground while I'm keeping everything else here still, then if that encourages a deeper stretch, if that promotes a deeper stretch, then have at it. After we sit here for 2 minutes or so, big deep breath. This is where we begin our isometrics. Because we're focusing on this back leg, you're going to start driving your foot into the ground, and I want you to imagine that you're in this position and you're actually trying to externally rotate your femur, your upper thigh bone. And so as you push into the ground, you should feel the stretched area now contracted. That is your PAIL, your progressive angular isometric load. That is the open side of the joint, and we feel a stretch, and then we contract that stretch stretched tissue. If you start pushing down and you feel your knee, you are torquing from the knee, you're producing force from the knee, and you are not producing force from your hip. So again, if you're one of those people that can't seem to find their hip in this position, we need to be turning our hip on in a drill previously done to this. So you need to warm up and turn your hips on before you get into the 90-90 position, whether that's through cars, EQIs, isometrics of other kinds, things like that. So as I start driving down, I feel my hip contracting. Typically speaking, I tell people to sit here for about a minute, but it's a case-by-case thing. If you can push harder and squeeze your hip harder and feel the association between driving the foot into the ground, the rotation of the femur where you're actually trying to externally rotate your hip, and you can contract your hip harder while doing so, you should absolutely be doing that. Generally speaking, I say a minute, and I would tell you to do 30 seconds of some moderate tension, 50, 60%, and then 15 seconds of dialing it up to 70, 80%, and then for the last 15 seconds, 100% effort, pushing our ankle down as hard as we can into the ground, and we're going to go for another 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and it's really important as you do your isometrics, you are not letting your pelvis come out of the end range of motion. We need to ensure that we are at the very end of whatever internal rotation we have so that we are contracting the deepest tissue that we otherwise would not have access to. We are in a passive range of motion and we are actively contracting the tissue in that passive range. But remember, we need to ensure that we find the stretch first. We have no pinching in the hip. We have the proper tissue lengthening, stretching. We feel no knee torquing as we contract or from the passive stretch. And then we begin our isometrics at whatever intensity we can handle. If you're new to this, stay at a moderate intensity. Don't worry about going 100%. Over time, you'll develop the ability to do that better. After you do your Pails contraction, where you're pushing the foot down, you're going to do the reverse. You're going to rail, which is the regressive angular isometric loading. When we rail, what that's going to look like is you are going to try to pick your foot up off the ground, meaning you want to internally rotate your hip even further. But the idea is that as you lift up, you can see that my foot is shaking a bit and I can't actually pick my foot up. That's the point. If I was able to just lift my foot up like this, then I was not truly at the end range of motion of my hip. This is tissue training, not movement training. So if you are only focused on if I can lift my foot up or not, you have lost sight of the goal. The goal is to contract my hip's regressive tissue, which is going to feel different than the Pail. You're trying to contract the regressive tissue and you're trying to internally rotate deeper, maybe millimeters of range of motion, and if you feel a cramp, you need to work through it. If you have a hard time finding the rail, then you need to be doing EQIs like you could previous to starting your 90-90 as a warm-up. The EQI can help turn on your hips so that you get a little bit more out of this. I would hold the rail for 30 seconds to a minute and try to squeeze my hip as hard as I can manage, and if it cramps, work through it and keep turning it on and stimulate it as much as you can. And then we would relax. Some good practice that I like to do here is maintaining the position of my hands and my spine, and then I would rotate and open up my leg without moving my spine or my pelvis, as little as possible, as little movement there as possible. And then I'm going to rotate all the way back to the end range, and it's going to be real tender. Hit that end range, feel the hip contract. Open back up.